My name was Lexi, and on that fateful day, I felt the foundations of my world begin to crumble beneath my feet. As I stood there, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to change irrevocably. When my stepmother, Trisha, summoned me, a chill ran down my spine, as if my very soul sensed the impending doom. Her eyes, usually as cold as a winter's night, held something different, something that made my stomach churn with dread. I'll never forget the saccharine tone of her voice as she said, "Lexi, my dear child. Your obsession with helping the less fortunate has been a cause for concern for us." Those words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating me with their implications. She continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "Your father and I have decided it's time for you to learn a valuable lesson about the real world." My stomach clenched tight, as if trying to protect me from the blow I knew was coming. In my 30-odd years of life, I'd learned that when Trisha used the word lesson, it never boded well for anyone, least of all me. With my voice quavering like a leaf in the wind, I managed to ask, "What are you talking about, Trisha?" I tried desperately to keep the fear from my voice, but I'm sure she heard it anyway. Her response hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. "We're talking about consequences, my dear. And about marriage." Marriage? The word echoed in my mind like a gunshot in an empty room. I'd never even considered marriage, not with my passion for helping others taking up so much of my heart and time. As I stood there, reeling from her words, I felt as if I'd been thrown into a stormy sea without a life jacket. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test every fiber of my being and challenge everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the power of compassion.
In the scorching heat of a Phoenix afternoon, the sun beat down mercilessly on the city streets. There, on the sidewalk, sat David, a young man of 28, his disheveled hair and worn-out clothes a stark contrast to the bustling crowd around him. His once vibrant blue eyes were now clouded with exhaustion and hunger, telling a silent story of hardship. The ribs visible beneath his tattered t-shirt spoke volumes about weeks of impoverished living. As David watched the hurried comings and goings of people, he felt like a ghost among the living, invisible to the world around him. His stomach growled painfully, a cruel reminder that he hadn't eaten in over 2 days. "Just one more day, David. You can do this. Today, someone will notice," he whispered to himself, clinging desperately to hope. But a bitter inner voice countered, "Who are you kidding? Nobody gives a beggar a second glance." As time crawled by, David fought the temptation to rummage through nearby trash cans for scraps. He had promised himself he wouldn't stoop to that level, but hunger was a relentless adversary. His eyes involuntarily followed passers-by carrying food bags and coffee cups, his mouth watering at the mere sight. The aroma of hot dogs from a nearby stand tormented his senses, causing saliva to pool in his mouth and his stomach to protest even more loudly. "Maybe I should try that shelter again. No, I can't. Last time." David shuddered, his thoughts trailing off. "How did things end up like this? I never wanted this. If only I had a family, a home." His heart ached as he painfully recalled his past. As the afternoon wore on, David's sense of despair deepened. He observed other homeless individuals approaching pedestrians for spare change, but he couldn't bring himself to do the same. His pride, the last thing he had left, prevented him. Not far from David, an older man sat watching him with a mix of sympathy and understanding in his eyes. "Son, sometimes things may seem hopeless, but we survive," the man said, his voice rough from age and street life. "I know. But sometimes, it feels like our life on the streets will never change. Just a few coins from kind people. We need more job opportunities, a home to escape to, and a healthy meal on a plate," David replied, his voice trembling between hope and disbelief. Suddenly, as if the universe had heard his silent plea, a middle-aged woman stopped in front of David. Without a word, she held out a paper bag containing a still-warm sandwich. The scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meat filled David's nostrils, making his stomach clench. David looked up at the woman, his eyes moist with gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. You don't know how much this means," he said, his voice quivering with emotion. The woman simply smiled kindly and walked away. David was moved by this act of kindness. Maybe there's still goodness in this world. Perhaps I'm not completely alone, David thought, feeling a spark of hope ignite in his chest. As David prepared to savor his precious sandwich, his eyes fell on two other men sitting nearby. Their gaunt faces and hungry looks mirrored his own situation. Without hesitation, David divided the sandwich into thirds and offered it to his unfortunate companions. "Hey, guys, let's share. No one should go hungry when we can help each other," he said in a hoarse but gentle voice. Across the street, two women watched this scene unfold.
I remember that day as if it were yesterday, the scorching sun beating down on the city streets, a stark reminder of the harsh realities some face every day. My name is Lexi, and I was that young woman with long golden hair and compassionate blue eyes, standing on the sidewalk, my heart constricting at the sight before me. I saw a young man, probably in his late 20s, sharing his meager sandwich with two others who looked just as desperate as he did. Their gaunt faces and hungry looks were a mirror to the harsh realities of life on the streets, a world I had been sheltered from for so long. Without thinking, I took a step towards the sidewalk, my hand already reaching for my purse, when I felt a rough yank on my arm. It was Trisha, my stepmother, her face a mask of stern disapproval, her eyes as cold as a winter's night. She hissed at me, telling me not to even think about getting involved with that kind of people. Her words stung like a slap across my face. I protested, my voice trembling with emotion and indignation, asking her how she could so easily ignore people in need. But Trisha was having none of it. She dragged me away from the scene, her high heels clicking a staccato rhythm on the sidewalk as we approached the high-end stores. The contrast between the glittering shop windows and the harsh reality of the street was jarring, like two different worlds existing side by side. I resisted, my eyes still fixed on the young man and his companions, their plight tugging at my heartstrings. Suddenly, Trisha stopped and spun around to face me, her face contorted with disgust and barely contained anger. She questioned my sanity, her sharp tone cutting through the air like a knife. She claimed those people were dangerous, that any money I gave them would probably be used for drugs or alcohol. But I couldn't accept her cold indifference. I argued back, my voice quivering with righteous anger, pointing out that the man had just shared what was probably his only meal of the day. Our argument was drawing curious glances from passers-by, but for once, I didn't care about appearances. I felt an unfamiliar courage welling up inside me, pushing me to stand my ground. I wrenched my arm free from Trisha's grasp and took a determined step towards the street. "They're human beings," I declared, my voice growing stronger with each word. "It's compassion that matters, not appearances." Trisha grabbed my arm again, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. She lectured me about how the world works, her condescending tone grating on my nerves. She claimed these people had chosen their lifestyle, that it wasn't our responsibility to save them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Who chooses to be hungry or homeless? I shot back, tears welling up in my eyes. How can you be so blind? In that moment, I made a decision. Before Trisha could stop me, I broke free once more. I quickly crossed the road, approaching the young man and his companions. With trembling hands, I took out some bills from my wallet. "Please, take this," I said, holding out the money to the young man. "I hope it helps in some way." Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a quiet connection pass between us. He thanked me, his voice quivering with emotion, telling me my kindness meant more than I could imagine. "It's nothing," I murmured, feeling a mix of relief and helplessness. I wish I could do more. As I stood there, caught between two worlds, I realized that this moment was a turning point in my life. I couldn't go back to ignoring the suffering around me, not after seeing it up close. Little did I know then how this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change my life forever.
Trisha observed the scene from a distance, her face a mixture of anger and something else, a calculating look that would send chills down one's spine. Her blue eyes narrowed, focusing intently on David, as if she were a predator eyeing its prey. There was something about him, something beyond his worn appearance that caught her attention. A plan began to take shape in her mind, a scheme that could potentially solve many of her problems in one fell swoop.
I slowly made my way back to the sidewalk, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest as I prepared for the inevitable confrontation with my stepmother. To my utter surprise, Trisha didn't immediately start yelling or scolding me as I'd expected. Instead, a cold smile crept across her lips, sending a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she suggested that if I was so eager to mingle with those people, perhaps I needed to learn a lesson about them. The way she said those people made my skin crawl, as if she were talking about a different species entirely, not fellow human beings in need. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake off. "What are you planning, Trisha?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, suddenly anxious about the change in her demeanor.
As the two women departed, Trisha cast a final glance at David. David's eyes shone with a cold determination, a stark contrast to his earlier vulnerability. It was clear that an idea was taking shape in Trisha's calculating mind.
I was so lost in my thoughts, replaying my brief encounter with David, that I didn't notice Trisha's sudden change in attitude or the calculating look in her eyes. There was something about him that I couldn't shake off, a dignity and kindness that stood in stark contrast to his harsh circumstances. It reminded me of the resilience I'd seen in some of the older folks I'd volunteered with at the senior center, people who'd faced hardships but still managed to maintain their humanity. Suddenly, Trisha's voice cut through my reverie, casual but with an undercurrent of coldness that made me shiver. She remarked that there was something different about that young man. I couldn't hide the suspicion in my voice as I asked her why she was suddenly interested in him when just minutes ago she told me to ignore him completely. The contrast was as jarring as switching channels from a heartwarming Hallmark movie to a chilling crime drama. When we arrived at the mansion, Trisha flung open the door with a flourish. The sound of her heels echoing through the marble entrance hall reminded me of my grandmother's stories about the clickety-clack of trains, a sound that used to signal new adventures but now felt ominous. I followed her silently, still reeling from the afternoon's events. It felt like I was walking into the lion's den, my heart pounding with each step. Dad must have heard our noisy arrival because he appeared from his study, his brow furrowed with worry. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of an afternoon. Trisha didn't bother with pleasantries. Her voice, filled with indignation, bounced off the walls as she announced that I had lost my mind, talking to beggars on the street. The way she said "beggars" made my blood boil, as if she were talking about a particularly nasty insect infestation rather than human beings. I watched Dad's face cycle through confusion and disappointment as he looked from Trisha to me. When he asked if it was true, his voice sounded as tired as he looked. It reminded me of the times he'd caught me sneaking out as a teenager, but this felt so much more important. I answered him, my voice shaking slightly but my conviction unwavering.
Trisha grabbed Matthew's arm and dragged him into the study, slamming the door behind them and leaving Lexi outside. The muffled sounds of their heated argument seeped through the thick oak door. "Can't you see the danger, Matthew?" Trisha exclaimed, her eyes blazing as she gesticulated wildly. "She's fraternizing with the dregs of society, ruining our reputation." Matthew sank deep into his leather chair, rubbing his face wearily like a man who'd seen too many battles. "Trisha, she has a kind heart," he protested weakly. "We can't fault her for that." Trisha's voice cut through the air like a knife. "A kind heart? In this world? Kindness is a weakness we can't afford." The argument intensified as Trisha began listing all of Lexi's recent transgressions: unauthorized donations to charities, volunteering in impoverished areas, refusing to attend important social events. Matthew's face grew paler with each accusation, like a man watching his world crumble before his eyes. "She's destroying everything we've built, Matthew," Trisha hissed, her voice filled with anger. "Our social standing, our connections, it's all at risk because of this. This obsession with helping the less fortunate." Matthew protested, "But she's my daughter, Trisha. We can't just change who she is." His voice, however, already carried a hint of resignation, like a flag lowered in defeat. Trisha stopped her frantic pacing and turned to Matthew, her eyes gleaming dangerously like a cat that's cornered its prey. "I have a plan," she announced, her voice suddenly calm and controlled. A plan to solve two problems at once. Matthew straightened in his chair, suddenly on guard like a soldier who's heard the first rumble of distant artillery. He knew this tone of Trisha's, and it usually didn't bode well. "What kind of plan?" he asked cautiously, dreading the answer. "A plan to teach Lexi a lesson," Trisha replied with a cold smile that could freeze the Sahara. Silence descended upon the study, heavy and suffocating like a thick fog. Matthew stared at Trisha, his eyes a mix of fear and curiosity, like a man watching a cobra uncoil. He knew he should protest, should defend his daughter. But years of Trisha's schemes and manipulations had worn away his resolve like water eroding a stone. "What exactly do you have in mind?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Trisha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with an almost maniacal light. She suggested using the beggar Lexi had tried to help, to show her that such people aren't as good as she thinks. Her voice dripped with malice as she proposed letting Lexi see up close how evil people like him can be. Matthew felt a chill run down his spine as he asked Trisha what she was thinking. Suddenly, Trisha stood up, her figure casting a threatening shadow over Matthew. She walked to the study window, a cold smile playing on her lips as she gazed out at the well-manicured garden. With a voice full of cruel satisfaction, Trisha declared that they would force Lexi to marry the beggar. Matthew choked on his whiskey, his eyes wide with disbelief. He jumped up from his chair, shouting that Trisha must be crazy and that it was inhumane. Trisha responded coolly that it wasn't inhumane, but a necessary lesson. She asked Matthew to consider if there was a better way to show Lexi the harsh realities of the world than living with someone like that. Matthew began pacing the study, running his hand through his gray hair in a desperate gesture. He argued for his daughter's happiness, insisting she deserved better. Despite his obvious anxiety, his voice was resolute. Trisha turned to face him, her eyes shining with merciless determination. She explained that they were talking about Lexi's future, asking Matthew to imagine the looks and whispers at social events. Trisha insisted Lexi needed to understand the consequences of her thoughtless actions. Matthew questioned if this was right, expressing pride in his daughter's strong character and kind heart. He doubted she would be easily shaken by such things. Trisha laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed off the study walls. She dismissed Matthew's concerns with a contemptuous gesture, saying Lexi may have a kind heart but she's still a girl raised in luxury. Trisha predicted that after a few days living with the beggar, Lexi would come begging to her senses. Matthew leaned against the desk, the weight of Trisha's proposal evident in his slumped shoulders and weary expression. He skeptically asked how they would persuade the young man to participate in this charade. Trisha confidently answered that money would do the trick, saying she'd offer an amount he couldn't refuse in his situation. Silence fell over the study, heavy and suffocating. Matthew stared into space, a storm of conflicting emotions battling in his heart. Finally, he murmured that he didn't know, that this seemed to be going too far. He asked if they couldn't just talk to Lexi. His voice was full of doubt. Trisha approached him, softening her tone but maintaining its strength as she spoke. "Matthew, my dear," Trisha said, her voice a mix of persuasion and false sympathy, "words alone aren't enough. Lexi needs to see for herself. Sometimes, we must be cruel to be kind." Matthew protested, his face revealing his inner turmoil. But forcing her into marriage, toying with her life like this. There must be another way. He slowly stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the world that seemed so complex and full of pitfalls for his beloved daughter. With a deep sigh, he turned back to Trisha. "This won't work. You're underestimating Lexi and the strength of her convictions," he murmured, genuine concern in his voice. Irritated by Matthew's reluctance, Trisha crossed her arms, her eyes flashing with anger. "Your hesitation is exactly why Lexi has lost her mind. Sometimes we need to make tough decisions. You're her father. You should be teaching her to protect her reputation," she asserted sharply. As the sun began to set over Central Park, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, David sat on a worn bench, watching people pass by. A graceful figure approached, Trisha, looking out of place in her designer coat and high heels. She stopped in front of David, her cold eyes appraising him from head to toe. "You're the beggar from earlier. I'm Trisha, Lexi's stepmother. The woman who was with me when she helped you, she said, her voice a mix of contempt and false kindness. David stood up, confused and wary. Yes, that's me. I'm David. What do you want? He replied, his voice unfamiliar even to himself. I have a proposal for you. One that could completely change your life, Trisha declared with a calculating smile. Wasting no time on pleasantries, Trisha explained her plan to David, arranging his marriage to Lexi and promising a comfortable, luxurious life in return for his cooperation. David listened, his eyes wide with disbelief. You want me to marry your stepdaughter? The young woman who kindly helped me today, for money? He asked incredulously. Trisha nodded, her smile unwavering. Think about it, David. You'll never have to worry about food or shelter again. You can have everything you've ever dreamed of, she argued in a snake-like, seductive voice. I can't accept this. I can't use someone like that, especially someone who was kind to me, David replied, shaking his head. David's refusal seemed to irritate Trisha, but she maintained her composure and changed tactics. Trisha decided to appeal to a different side of David. In a low, persuasive voice, she suggested he consider the possibilities. With that money, he could help many people, his friends on the street who suffer from hunger every day. David clenched his fists, hesitating as he pondered Trisha's words. A fleeting image of his desperate, hungry street companions crossed his mind. I could really make a difference, he murmured, more to himself than to Trisha. Sensing David's doubt, Trisha pressed on, urging him to imagine how many lives he could change. She suggested that Lexi would do the same, using her resources to help others. As David contemplated, his eyes drifted to Trisha's coat, settling on a golden brooch pinned to the collar. It was an intricate design of roses intertwined with ivy. Something about the brooch stirred a distant memory in David, a hazy recollection from long ago. Unconsciously, he reached out, almost touching the brooch. This brooch. I've seen it before, he whispered, his voice trembling with sudden emotion. Trisha stepped back slightly, seemingly surprised by David's reaction. She quickly dismissed it as just an old family heirloom, covering the brooch with her hand. Strange. I remember this brooch, David mused to himself, grappling with fragments of distant childhood memories. He recalled someone wearing it, a woman singing to him. Trisha urged him to leave, insisting that his decision could help many people. David nodded, and before departing, he turned to his street companions, promising to return with help. Don't worry, David said, his voice quivering with emotion. I'll be back. I'll find a way to help everyone. Sitting in the car, surrounded by the smell of new leather, David continued to ponder the strange familiarity of Trisha's brooch and the surreal proposal she had presented. I hope I'm doing the right thing. But if this can help others, maybe it's worth it, he muttered to himself, nervously tapping his fingers on his knee. A few minutes later, Trisha's luxurious car silently glided through the mansion gates. David sat in the back seat, staring in awe at the imposing house looming before him.
I was sitting by the window in my room, lost in a book, when the sound of a car pulled me from my literary escape. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peered out, only to have my eyes widen in shock. There was David, the man I'd helped earlier, climbing out of the car in his worn-out clothes, looking as out of place as a penguin in the Sahara. My heart started racing, pounding against my ribcage like a trapped bird. What on earth is going on? I whispered to myself, confusion and anxiety swirling in my gut. The wheels in my head were turning faster than a hamster's exercise wheel. Why has Trisha brought him here? This can't be good. What has she done to him? I watched as Trisha ushered David into the house, feeling like I was witnessing a scene from a bizarre dream. She caught my eye through the window and shot me a look that sent chills down my spine. I heard her tell David to wait in the foyer, her stilettos clicking on the marble floor as she marched up the stairs with determination. When she knocked on my door and entered without waiting for a response, I knew the other shoe was about to drop. Her saccharine tone made my teeth ache as she told me we needed to talk. I turned to face her, my expression a cocktail of confusion and fear. Trisha, what's going on? Why is he here? I asked, my voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. She told me everything would be clear soon, but I needed to sit down first. I complied reluctantly, never taking my eyes off her face, feeling like a mouse being cornered by a particularly cruel cat. As she paced the room, her heels echoing on the hardwood floor, I felt my stomach twist into knots. She started by saying my obsession with helping the less fortunate had been a cause for concern, and that she and Dad had decided it was time for me to learn a valuable lesson about the real world. I felt like I'd swallowed a boulder. What are you talking about, Trisha? I asked, dreading the answer. Her response hit me like a sucker punch to the gut. We're talking about consequences, my dear. And about marriage. I shot to my feet, my hands shaking. Marriage? What marriage? I demanded, my voice rising an octave. When she told me I was to marry David, the man I tried so hard to help earlier that day, I felt the blood drain from my face. This is insane. You can't be serious, I cried, my voice echoing off the walls. But she was serious, deadly serious. And before I could even think about refusing, she was threatening me with the consequences of non-cooperation. I stumbled backward, collapsing onto my bed as my mind raced to process the absurdity of the situation. I was just trying to help someone in need. What was so wrong with that? You can't force this. It's illegal, it's immoral, I argued, tears welling up in my eyes. Trisha leaned in close, her face inches from mine. Her threat about David facing serious accusations if I didn't comply made my blood run cold. In that moment, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, desperately wishing I could wake up. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Don't do this, I pleaded, my voice barely above a whisper. He's innocent. This has nothing to do with him. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and fear was taking over my heart like an icy flood. I struggled to find my voice, desperately trying to understand. Why are you doing this, Trisha? What do you gain from this? Her cold laugh sent shivers down my spine, reminding me of the villains in those old movies my dad and I used to watch together on rainy Sunday afternoons. She straightened up, looking down at me like I was a bug she was considering whether to squash. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. She told me that what she'd gain was a stepdaughter who understood her place in this family and in society. She said I needed to learn that my actions had consequences, and that not everyone I tried to help deserved my sympathy. I felt cornered, like a mouse trapped by a particularly cruel cat. My eyes wandered to the window where I'd seen David arrive earlier. The thought that he might suffer because of me was unbearable. It made me think of all those times I'd watched my classmates being bullied in high school and how helpless I'd felt then. But this was so much worse. If I agree, what will happen to David? I asked, my voice barely audible, like a child afraid to hear the answer. Trisha's response was chilling, despite her motherly tone. She said he'd live comfortably, off the streets. And I, her dear child, would learn a valuable lesson about the real world. I shuddered at the coldness underlying her words, feeling like I was in one of those psychological thrillers my book club had been reading lately. But this wasn't fiction, this was my life, and I was terrified of what might come next. I couldn't help but think of all those soap operas my grandmother used to watch, with their dramatic twists and turns. Who would have thought my life would suddenly resemble one? As I sat there, my mind racing, I realized that this moment would change everything. The world I thought I knew was crumbling around me, and I had no idea how to stop it.
David was led to a luxurious bathroom adjacent to his new room. His eyes widened at the sight of the enormous marble bathtub and the neatly arranged toiletries on the vanity. The butler pointed to soft towels and shaving supplies, saying everything he needed was there. Still dazed by the situation, David turned on the faucet once alone, watching warm water fill the tub. He murmured to himself, wondering when he last had a real bath, as he slowly removed his tattered clothes. David pondered anxiously if all the dirt would come off and if he remembered how to bathe properly. As he sank into the tub, David couldn't suppress a moan of pleasure. Years of grime began to dissolve as he scrubbed vigorously with a soft sponge and fragrant soap. He submerged his head, washing his hair multiple times. The water quickly turned murky, a silent testament to his years on the streets. David soaked in the tub until the water cooled, savoring every moment of cleanliness and comfort. He whispered that he felt reborn, gazing at his clean skin for the first time in years. David marveled at how a simple bath could make one feel so human again. Wrapped in a soft towel, David looked at his reflection in the foggy mirror. His beard was long and unkempt, hiding most of his face. With trembling hands, he picked up a razor and shaving cream. He carefully began to shave, gradually revealing a face he had forgotten. Each stroke of the razor seemed to remove not just hair, but the grime of street life. When finished, David could barely recognize the man staring back at him in the mirror. He touched his now smooth cheek, murmuring in disbelief that this was really him. David felt he was looking at a stranger from the past. Putting on the new clothes provided, David felt like a different person. The soft, well-fitting fabric was a stark contrast to the rags he was accustomed to. He fidgeted uncomfortably with the shirt collar, unaccustomed to feeling so groomed. Taking one last look in the mirror, David took a deep breath, preparing to meet the others. He reassured himself that with this new life, he could help many people. As he descended the stairs, David felt all eyes turn to him.
I stood at the bottom of the stairs, and when I saw him, I felt my breath catch in my throat. Our eyes met, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. "David, I hardly recognized you," I whispered, my voice a mix of surprise and something I couldn't quite name. When Trisha appeared, looking at David with disdain, I felt a surge of protectiveness wash over me. She commented on how he'd at least cleaned up nicely, her tone falsely bright, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from snapping at her. David seemed at a loss for words, and as we headed to the dining room, I couldn't help but notice his eyes darting to me repeatedly. I wondered what he was thinking, feeling exposed in a way I'd never experienced before, even during my debutante days. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and mounting tension. As I sat in the plush chair at the high-end salon, watching the hairdresser put the finishing touches on my bridal hairstyle, I couldn't help but stare at my reflection. My eyes were a mix of sadness and quiet determination, much like my mother's had been in those old photos from the 60s protests. I gently placed my hand on the white dress draped across my lap, the fabric as soft as a cloud but feeling as heavy as lead. My thoughts kept drifting to David and the remarkable transformation he'd undergone in just a few days. He must be as confused as I am, I murmured to myself. Maybe this marriage is really an opportunity to help him, to make the difference I've always wanted to make. My heart clenched with empathy, and a small smile tugged at my lips. The hairdresser, noticing my pensive expression, tried to lighten the mood with some small talk. She asked if I was looking forward to the big day, her tone as kind as my old Sunday school teachers. I hesitated for a moment before answering, "It's complicated, but I'm determined to make the best of this situation." I met her eyes in the mirror, seeing a flicker of concern that reminded me of my grandmother's knowing looks. My mind wandered to the moments I'd shared with David over the past few days. The awkward conversations, the shy smiles, the obvious gratitude in his eyes. He deserves a chance to turn his life around, I thought. And maybe together, we can find some greater purpose in all of this. As the hairdresser added the final touches to my hairstyle, I found myself observing the salon's bustling activity in the mirror. I thought about all the people out there like David, who needed help. My mind began to formulate plans, ways I could use my position and skills to make a difference, even within the constraints of this forced marriage. It reminded me of how my mother used to organize charity events, always finding a way to help others no matter the circumstances. When the hairdresser interrupted my thoughts to ask if I was satisfied with the result, I smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "It's perfect, thank you," I replied, feeling a spark of hope ignite in my chest. This might not have been the path I'd chosen, but I was determined to make it mean something. As I sat there, a wave of determination washed over me. This could be the beginning of something important, I thought to myself, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my college days volunteering at the local soup kitchen. Just then, I overheard a snippet of conversation between two salon employees nearby. One of them whispered, asking if the other remembered the scandal involving Trisha's stepdaughter. My ears perked up like a cat hearing a can opener. The other employee nodded and leaned in closer, saying it was unforgettable. She mentioned rumors about Trisha being involved in something terrible, though nothing was ever proven. Their conversation abruptly stopped when they noticed my gaze in the mirror. They scurried away, looking as guilty as kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. I felt my heart racing, pounding like a drum in my chest. Something terrible? What on earth was Trisha involved in? I wondered, my mind reeling. It made me question everything I thought I knew about her. She always claimed to love being part of our family, but sometimes she acted like she hated me more than Nixon hated tape recorders. Thoughts whirled through my mind like a tornado, connecting the employee's words with my own observations over the past few days. I remembered how Trisha always avoided talking about her past before marrying Dad, changing the subject faster than a politician dodging a tough question. There was a mystery here, and I was determined to unravel it like a detective in one of those noir films Dad loved. I walked towards the salon window, my reflection in the glass showing not just a bride, but a woman with a mission. I'll get to the bottom of this, I promise myself, my expression as determined as moms used to be before a big civil rights march. If Trisha's hiding something, I'll find out what it is. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to dive into unknown waters. But I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't go through with this wedding until I uncovered the truth, no matter how ugly it might be.
A few hours later, as the afternoon sun illuminated the majestic facade of the church, a procession of luxury cars began to arrive. David, still uncomfortable in his new suit, nervously observed from the entrance. As the invited guests, members of high society, stepped out of their cars, curious and critical eyes turned towards David. Whispers and murmurs filled the air, with words like beggar and scandal reaching his ears. David felt his stomach churn as reality hit him full force. He muttered to himself, questioning why he was there and why these people seemed so disgusted by him, wondering if Lexi thought the same. Repeatedly adjusting his tie, he desperately searched the crowd for a friendly face. An elderly couple passed by David, the woman unable to hide her look of revulsion. She whispered loudly enough for David to hear, saying she'd heard from Trisha that he had been living on the streets just last week, and how humiliating it must be for poor Lexi. Her husband nodded, casting a contemptuous glance at David. He responded that it must be some kind of punishment, exposing the family like this and associating with someone like him, and that Lexi must have lost her mind. David felt the blood drain from his face, the impact like a punch to the gut. He realized Trisha had deliberately spread his background, making Lexi a spectacle to be humiliated in front of everyone. David thought to himself that he was just a tool to shame Lexi, feeling foolish. Anger and shame mingled in his chest. As more guests arrived, each glance and whisper increased David's distress. He noticed Trisha in the distance, greeting guests with a fake smile and occasionally casting triumphant looks his way. David clenched his fists, fighting the urge to confront her right there. A gentle hand touched his shoulder, startling David. Matthew whispered, barely audibly, that he was truly sorry about all of this. Before David could respond, Matthew had already disappeared into the crowd. David thought desperately that even her father seemed to be a victim of this twisted game. An elderly gentleman leaning on a cane approached David. His eyes widened as he saw David up close, surprise and recognition dawning on his wrinkled face. The old man whispered, "It can't be," while intently studying David's features. For a moment, David felt a glimmer of hope, thinking this man might not judge him for his homelessness. The old man looked around carefully. It was as if he was afraid of being overheard. He then leaned in close to David and whispered urgently that they needed to talk privately, right away. His voice trembled with barely contained emotion as he called it an emergency. Surprised and intrigued, David nodded slowly. In a low, anxious voice, he asked why and if there was a problem. The old man glanced around again before responding. He said they couldn't talk there and arranged to meet behind the church in 5 minutes, insisting David needed to know something. With that, he hurried away as fast as his cane would allow. David stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was far more ominous and intriguing than he had imagined. His mind raced with possibilities about what was happening, who this man was, and what he wanted to say. After hearing everything from the old man, a shocked David returned to the church interior. Tension filled the air as guests took their seats. Standing at the altar, David felt his heart beating furiously in his chest. The old man's confession still fresh in his mind, he anxiously watched the church entrance. Despite the storm of emotions consuming him, he was determined to go through with this plan for Lexi's sake. The pastor noticed David's tense expression and looked at him with concern. He whispered, asking if David was all right. David set his jaw with determination and simply nodded. He thought to himself that he needed to stay strong, that Lexi deserved to know the truth. But not like this, not here, he wouldn't abandon her at the altar. "I'm fine, Pastor," he answered.
As the music began to play, I felt every eye in the church turn towards me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, feeling like I was about to step onto a stage for the school play all over again, only with much higher stakes. As I walked down the aisle in my wedding dress, I tried to project an image of radiance, but I knew my eyes told a different story, one of fear and determination. Each step felt like I was wading through molasses, the effort monumental. I couldn't help but feel like I was marching towards an uncertain fate, reminiscent of those civil rights marches my parents used to tell me about. I caught sight of Trisha in the front row, her face adorned with a self-satisfied smile that made my skin crawl. As I approached the altar, my eyes met David's for a brief moment. In that instant, I felt a connection, an unspoken understanding passing between us. We were two souls united against a greater force, like resistance fighters in one of those World War II movies my dad loves so much. I barely heard Reverend Charles as he began the ceremony, his words washing over me like white noise. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife, each word from the Reverend ratcheting it up another notch. Finally, we reached that pivotal moment. "If anyone has reason to object to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace," the Reverend declared. A heavy silence fell over the church, reminding me of the quiet before a summer storm. I held my breath, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Then, to everyone's shock, Trisha suddenly stood up. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife through butter. My heart nearly stopped, and I'm sure my eyes were as wide as saucers. What is she doing? I thought, panic starting to set in. Does she know something? As Trisha made her way down the center aisle, I felt like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion, horrified, but unable to look away. Little did I know, this moment would change everything, setting in motion a chain of events that would turn my world upside down. As Trisha's heels clicked down the aisle, the sound echoed through the stunned silence of the church. I felt like I was in one of those old soap operas my grandmother used to watch, where the villain always had a dramatic reveal at the worst possible moment. Trisha's face wore a cruel smile as she took her place beside the altar, facing everyone. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest, like something from a sci-fi horror film. Trisha's sickeningly sweet voice cut through the air as she addressed the guests, saying they deserved to know the truth about this marriage. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt pinned in place, unable to move or speak. I must have looked like a deer caught in headlights, my face as pale as my wedding dress. As Trisha continued, pointing at me and talking about how I thought I could challenge our social standing by associating with a street trash, I felt my world crumbling around me. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I managed to whisper a plea for her to stop, my voice shaking like a leaf in a storm. But Trisha's response was as sharp as a knife, telling me it was too late for pleas and that I had brought this on myself. As she turned to the guests with a theatrical gesture, I felt like I was watching a train wreck in slow motion, horrified but unable to look away. Trisha's words about me choosing to marry a beggar, a man who was living on the streets just a week ago, sent whispers of shock and disapproval rippling through the church. I glanced at David, seeing his fists clenched at his sides, and I could almost feel the anger radiating off him. As Trisha continued her merciless speech about the consequences of forgetting one's place and refusing to respect societal traditions, I felt a spark of something ignite within me. It was like a fire starting in my chest, burning away the shock and hurt. When Dad finally stood up, his voice shaking with indignation as he demanded to know how Trisha could do this to his daughter, I felt a surge of love for him. But Trisha's cold laugh in response sent chills down my spine. Her words about me choosing this path and having to face the consequences were the final straw. I felt my face burning with humiliation, but something in my eyes changed. That spark had turned into a flame of determination, replacing the initial shock. I took a step forward, ready to face whatever came next. I was ready to face Trisha, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest, when suddenly David stepped forward. He placed himself between Trisha and me, his eyes blazing with an intensity that silenced everyone in the church. I held my breath as David declared in a low, powerful voice that enough was enough, and that Trisha's lies had to stop. The church fell, so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. It reminded me of those tense moments in courtroom dramas my dad used to watch. Trisha stumbled back a step, clearly caught off guard by David's intervention. She hissed at him, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. I could see she was starting to lose her composure. As David stared straight into Trisha's eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was like watching two gunslingers face off in an old western. He told her he was speaking the truth she'd hidden for so long. His voice grew stronger with each word. The silence in the church was palpable as David took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Trisha's face. He took a deep breath, and I could almost feel him gathering his courage. It was like watching someone prepare to jump off a high dive for the first time. When David finally began to speak, his voice was strong and clear, echoing off the church walls like a judge delivering a verdict. He announced that the time for truth had come, that Trisha thought she could bury the past, but it always finds a way to come to light. My jaw dropped as David revealed his true identity, Christian Jones, Trisha's stepson whom she had abandoned years ago. As he unfolded his story, the old man who recognized him, the birthmark that confirmed his identity, the years spent on the streets, I felt like I was watching a mystery novel come to life before my eyes. Each revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Trisha had not only manipulated me, but she had destroyed an innocent child's life for her own gain. When David turned to me, his eyes softening, I felt my heart skip a beat. He told me that my kindness and compassion had given him the strength to face this truth. In that moment, I realized that my small act of kindness on the street had set in motion something far bigger than I could have ever imagined. It was like those stories of how a butterfly flapping its wings can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. As I stood there, trying to process everything, I couldn't help but think of all those times I doubted myself, wondered if my efforts to help others really mattered. I knew then, they mattered more than I could have ever dreamed. As David continued to speak, I felt my world shifting beneath my feet. His words about Trisha's obsession with social status, her contempt for the less fortunate, and her cruelty disguised as life lessons, it all suddenly made sense. It was like watching the final pieces of a complex puzzle fall into place, revealing a picture I never expected to see. I realized that all of this had been an elaborate mask to hide her past, to bury the truth of what she'd done to David and his father. As David declared that it was over, that the truth was out, I felt a surge of emotions, relief, anger, and a strange sense of vindication. He was right, Trisha could no longer hide behind her lies and deceit. When David said he was there to claim his identity and rightful place in the world, to ensure justice was finally served, I felt a swell of pride for him. This man, whom I'd first met as a stranger on the street, had shown more courage and integrity than I'd ever seen. As David finished speaking, chaos erupted in the church. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the impact of his words. It was like being hit by a tidal wave of truth, leaving me stunned and breathless. I watched Trisha, pale and trembling, seeming to shrink under the weight of the revealed truth. It reminded me of the Wizard of Oz, when the curtain is pulled back to reveal the truth behind the illusion. Dad moved away from Trisha, staring at her with a look of shock on his face. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, and I could tell he didn't like what he saw. The days following David's dramatic confession were a whirlwind of change for all of us. David decided to take a DNA test with distant relatives of the Jones family to prove his identity beyond doubt. The wait for the results was tense, reminding me of those anxious days waiting for college acceptance letters. On a sunny afternoon, David, Dad, and I gathered in the family lawyer's office. The moment the envelope with the test results was opened with trembling hands, I held my breath. When the lawyer announced that the test was positive, that David was indeed Joshua Jones's long-lost son, the silence in the room was deafening. I squeezed David's hand tightly, feeling tears of relief and joy welling up in my eyes. Dad placed a comforting hand on David's shoulder, still trying to process everything. As David whispered about the truth finally coming to light after so many years, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. His words about the blindfold being removed and still being able to find happiness despite everything resonated deeply within me. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a new one. For all of us.
The consequences for Trisha were swift and severe. She faced lengthy legal proceedings, accused of fraud, deceit, and even involvement in Joshua Jones's death. Days later, police arrived at the mansion with a search warrant. Trisha, still in shock, watched helplessly as officers searched each room, seizing documents, computers, and even her precious brooch, now a key piece of evidence. The prosecution, making an example of an influential figure, pushed for a full investigation into Joshua's mysterious death, previously ruled an accident. The high society that once worshipped Trisha began to avoid her like the plague. Her social standing crumbled as rapidly as it had been built. The phone stopped ringing, invitations to charity events and fancy dinners vanished overnight. Old friends, fearing association with her might tarnish their own reputations, turned their backs when they saw her on the street. As the investigation continued, Trisha's assets were frozen, cutting off access to what she once thought was limitless wealth. The mansion she had turned into her personal castle now felt like a gilded prison, with reporters camped outside hoping for a glimpse of the fallen socialite. Ironically, Trisha found herself isolated and alone, experiencing some of the despair she had inflicted on David years ago. As evidence mounted and details of her schemes came to light, it became clear that Trisha faced not only social ruin but also the very real possibility of spending years in prison.
I never imagined that the adversity David and I faced together would bring us even closer. We decided to have an intimate wedding ceremony, worlds apart from the spectacle Trisha had planned. This time, there were no lies or hidden agendas. Just true love and a shared desire to make a difference in the world. I remember taking David's hand and suggesting we combine our resources to help people in situations like the one he had once been in. The excitement and determination that lit up his eyes in that moment is something I'll never forget. He agreed wholeheartedly, saying there was nothing he'd love more than to turn our tragedy into something positive. Over the next few months, David and I poured our hearts into establishing a foundation to support homeless individuals and abandoned children. We worked tirelessly to provide shelter, education, and opportunities to those often forgotten by society. It warmed my heart to see Dad, who deeply regretted his unwitting role in Trisha's scheme, throw himself into our charitable efforts with gusto. David's story, from beggar to lost heir to philanthropist, captured the public's imagination. He became a symbol of hope and redemption, proving that even the most adverse circumstances could be overcome. I'll never forget that quiet evening when we stood on our balcony, watching the sunset. David turned to me and shared how he'd felt lost for years, searching for something he couldn't name. Now, he said, he realized what he'd been looking for all along: family, purpose, and love. I smiled and snuggled closer to him, reminding him that it all started with a simple act of kindness on the street. I told him never to underestimate the power of helping someone. It can change the world. What began as a cruel plan for revenge and humiliation had transformed into a story of love, redemption, and hope. David and I, bound together by unimaginable adversity, dedicated our lives to turning past pain into a brighter future for others. The foundation we established quickly became a powerful force for change in the city. We opened shelters for the homeless that offered not just a roof, but rehabilitation programs and job training too. Abandoned children found loving homes through carefully considered adoption programs. Each year, dozens of young people received scholarships, giving them a chance to break the cycle of poverty David knew all too well. The impact of our work rippled outward, like waves on a lake. Other wealthy families, inspired by our example, began to reassess their priorities. A city once known for its insensitive elite gained a new reputation for compassion and social progress. David, now a symbol of resilience, frequently speaks at schools and universities, sharing his story and encouraging others never to lose hope. Meanwhile, I use my social connections to gather support for causes once ignored by high society. Together, we show that a person's true worth lies not in social status or bank accounts, but in the ability to reach out and lift others up. Our story serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, kindness can prevail, and a single compassionate act can spark profound change. As the years passed, David and I look back on the journey that had brought us here with awe and gratitude. What began as a simple act of kindness on a crowded street has blossomed into a life-changing movement. We continue to do our work tirelessly, one act of kindness at a time, determined to make the world a better place. Through it all, we proved that true love and compassion have the power to overcome even the deepest darkness.
If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support motivates us to bring you captivating stories almost every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to appear on the screen. We sincerely appreciate you being here with us. Please click the link displayed on the screen right now. We have a special selection guaranteed to offer valuable stories and enjoyable entertainment. We'll see you there.